Be comfortable.
Hi everybody, I'm here today with Junaid Ashraf, who is an SNP Councillor, Rector Candidate for the University of Glasgow, and the founder of the Meltingscot. And we're here today to discuss the quest for racial equality in a post-colonial Britain. Hi Junaid, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Fantastic to be here with you, James, today with the Association of Former British Colonies, and I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today.
Brilliant. So if you could start by telling the audience a bit about your background and who you are.
Okay, so my name is Junaid, as James said. I'm a councillor for the hometown that I grew up in Cumbernauld in Scotland. I am 24 years old. I was elected at 20 years old as a councillor whilst still at university. And throughout my time, I've been working on different equalities sort of policies within North Lankarshire Council, within my local authority, because it's of great importance to me. There's a surreal lack of representation within Scotland, as there is across the whole of the UK. So off of the back of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a lot of work being going on within my local authority. I've been very glad to be leading on and partnering with other councillors. So really excited to talk today about one of the specific motions, which really ties in well with the work that the Association of Former British Colonies is working on, to do with reparations, and also to do with just understanding our history within its context.
Thank you. So if you could start by telling the audience where your interest in racial equality comes from exactly.
Oh, well, I don't think it's that difficult to see where my interest in racial equality comes from, right? I got involved in something called the Scottish Youth Parliament when I was 14. My dad told me to find out about it. It's actually an organisation they set up alongside the Scottish Parliament back in 1999. So for every one MSP, member of the Scottish Parliament, there's 2 members of the Scottish Youth Parliament. So I ran for election in my local area. You do it through the schools and things like that. And lost my first election, actually. I ran again when I was 16 and I won it. Got involved in the Scottish Youth Parliament. There was about 120, 150 of us. Got involved in different committees we have. I got involved in the Equalities Committee. Through there, I learned a lot about, racial injustice across Scotland, learning about, infrastructure issues that they have within Scotland. And throughout all of that, although the Youth Parliament is very, very good in the youth work and things, and they built a lot of confidence within me, I was very much aware I was either the only or one of very few people from an ethnic minority background within any of these sort of circles, because ethnic minority Scots weren't engaging with it. That's not true. Ethnic minority Scots do engage with it, but perhaps these structures aren't very welcoming at times, or they don't engage well with the communities. I wouldn't ever put the fault on the ethnic minority communities. So further to that, I got involved in mainstream politics, and there's a surreal lack of representation, as I've said, within Scotland. So to put it into context, I'm a councillor for the Scottish National Party. We have 80% of the Westminster MPs within Scotland. 100% of them are white. MSPs, we've been in government for 13 years now. Out of the 60-ish MSPs that we have, only one comes from an ethnic minority background. And out of the 450 councillors, I believe we have elected, out of the 1,200 councillors that there are within Scotland, only 3 are Asian. So there's myself, my brother, who's also a councillor, and a councillor called Shahad Farouk, who's also within North Lankarshire Council. So I build a lot of racial equality work within my sort of a day-to-day life as a councillor, because quite frankly, nobody else is doing it. So there's a lot to work on, and I've been really glad that with the support of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're starting to see some movement here.
Okay, brilliant. So I wanted to put this in historical context, because at the AFBC, we're very much interested in providing an education on the legacies of the British Empire. So could you explain for our audience, how has the history of the British Empire shaped racial inequality that we see today?
Okay, well, I think it's interesting. So I can use myself as as an example, I suppose. So my grandparents from my mum's side came to Scotland after World War II ended. So grandfather came over first, then my grand came afterwards. Went on a boat 3 months. Went on every single port on the east side of Africa and on the west side, and then obviously arrived in Scotland. and she lived here to the the end of her life in 2014, and my grandfather passed away in 2004. And from there, there's a really interesting story that something that I like to reflect on a little bit, is that the context of the nation there wasn't very welcoming. I mean, nobody would dispute that. I don't believe that racial equality wasn't achieved there, but they don't really take into consideration the impact that it had for, obviously the reason being that they came over was post World War II. India was still obviously like a colonial sort of nation, obviously given up right after World War II. They asked for people from the Commonwealth to come across, and they were living here in poverty, essentially, doing menial jobs, just working to make ends meet, trying to make a life for them, for the future, for their kids and things like that. And that's the start of the lives of many, if not the majority perhaps, of within Scotland, the largest proportion of people that live within from an ethnic minority background or from a Pakistani background. So that's quite often the story of, I would think, a lot of ethnic minorities about their parents coming after the 1950s. You started off in the lowest rung, and with all the racial injustice that was there, then your parents grew up in that sort of same situation, perhaps often not making it to university or college or any level of education. I mean, you're making it to the third generation, first generation living in that poverty, no support whatsoever, racial injustice. Your parents living within racial, the 80s, 70s, 80s, whatever. They're living in that sort of period. No support. Their parents didn't know English, and then here comes in essentially us, the third generation. When you consider the path that we had for the two generations before, and I'm actually significantly impressed with how well a lot of second and third generations, Pakistanis, Indians, people from the same background as I do, have done within the UK, considering the background that we come from. So I think the supports that need to come in now that are ingrained within the infrastructure of a lot of our institutions. Like, for example, you take something I brought up within my speech for the Black Lives Matter motion, we'll speak about shortly after this, is that about the over-policing of minority communities, and speaking about, people to see this as an American issue. You look at the way that the police treated minority communities in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Stephen Lawrence case. You don't need to really go further than that to really describe the situation within the UK. And then for the police to basically just say now that, we're not racially motivated, against minority communities X, Y, Z. Well, where's the work been done to rebuild that connection with the communities and things like that? And this all comes off the back of the Commonwealth nation citizens coming here, or the Windrush generation, and the bad sort of situation that we had. I mean, these issues are intergenerational, and they haven't been combated. The very least that's been achieved here is basically, we stopped being racist. Why don't you stop complaining about it? And that I simply don't feel is comfortable enough within my line of work. Definitely not. So there's a lot more to be done here.
So before we start moving on to the Black Lives Matter and the motion and the speech that you have prepared, I really want to sort of engage, because, as you've just correctly said, there is a mentality that many people have that essentially suggests that slavery and colonialism was a long time ago. The legacies of it are non-existent, and racism essentially died when slavery died. What would you say to those people in terms of the legacies of colonialism in modern day society in Britain?
I mean, it's literally just a non-starter. I mean, we learn about World War I and World War II within our schools and high schools to like a ridiculous extent. About we learn about people in the trenches. We learn about all these different sort of things to do with World War I and World War II, which we should. Nobody's saying that we shouldn't learn about them. But then for people to turn around and say, but colonialism doesn't matter because it was so long ago. Pakistan was created after World War II. I mean, the fact that we need to learn about what Britain, the pain, the injustice, don't even use charged words like that. The history of Britain in the world needs to be taught and needs to be learned within Scotland, within the UK. And if you don't agree with that, then quite frankly, you're saying that we shouldn't be learning about great significant other aspects of our past, such as the world wars, which also need to be decolonized, which also I brought within my speeches and things like that, to do with the contribution of Indian soldiers, the financial contribution given by India. the financial contribution perhaps given by a lot of other Commonwealth countries, but I wouldn't know because it's not taught when you're in school. So for people that say that we need to teach more about our colonial past, I mean, I'm 100% with them. We definitely do.
Okay, brilliant. So that moves us to the next section of our podcast. So I really want to talk about your involvement in the Black Lives Matter movement. So could you tell our audience more about that, please?
Yeah, so when it came to obviously the death of George Floyd, I mean, we saw significant obviously attention being paid to racial equality within the UK across the world. Obviously, a lot of us from ethnic minority backgrounds may have started to pick up on the fact that perhaps all of these statements of solidarity were being backed up with statements that weren't necessarily backed up with anything behind it. It was just simply a statement of, we stand with you, XYZ, that's it. I mean, and these statements weren't really going to change anything. I mean, prime example perhaps being Blackout Tuesday. How much of an impact did that really have? But I am also positive about the movement, that anything that's done with the heart of obviously creating a positive change should be taken as that everything is a step in the right direction. But for myself, being involved in politics and having the position to obviously change something, I obviously wanted to do something solid for the movement. So, for example, the local authority I represent, which is North Lankarshire Council, which for your listeners will be like closest city, Glasgow. So we're just outside of Glasgow, right? I've been a councillor here for 3 years, and I've picked up on a number of issues that I believe need to be addressed, such as you know, black men are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than the general population within my local authority. And this was brought up during an equality strategy that was brought forward to the local authority back in January. And within that meeting, I'm sitting there, they're bringing up these different facts and figures, and I'm saying, okay, cool. And we're submitting this report for 5 years, you know, to look into racial injustice and looking at equality strategy. And it's a 40-page document, and not a single word actually says about how we're combating this at all. So it just simply states that, you know, 3 times more likely to be unemployed. And I put my hand up and ask a question. I said, what are we doing to tackle this? And I get the answer back, oh, we've got employment programs XYZ that we've got done. And I'm saying, okay, cool. I went back to said, you know, supplementary to that question. Could you actually answer my question? That isn't actually tackling unemployment within these minority communities. That tackles employment as a whole.
Yeah.
So say these that, you know, across the board, this program is actually successful. Black men are still 3 times more likely to be unemployed than the general population, and these sort of aspects need to be looked into through an intersectional approach. So there's about 12, I don't know how many things, 8, 9, 10 different things that I had worrying me about racial equality within the council. And through the Black Lives Matter motion that I was able to submit with the deputy leader of the administration, so I'm from the SNP, the person from the Labour Party was proposing the motion. I was able to talk about a number of these issues, which I'm happy to talk you through.
Absolutely, please. So tell us more about this motion then, please.
Right, so the motion specifically got down here, it says, just so you know, but the contents of the motion and the contents of my speech that builds on it is to do with the council recognises the objectives of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's quite further understands racial tensions which have been heightened and brought sharply into focus by the horrific death of George Floyd in the United States, resulting in the protests across the world. The council reaffirms that there is no place for racism and that further action must be taken to eliminate racial injustice and discrimination in Scotland. It acknowledges the efforts to end discrimination have been inadequate, and many residents of North Lankarshire continue to suffer racism and racial inequality on a daily basis. The council will establish a cross-party working group to look at how the local authority and partners can work to ensure that all residents are able to live lives free from racism or discrimination of any form. Notes that the working group will have representation from the BAME community. Recognizes that the working group will also review, and this is quite important, all the statues, historical symbols, buildings or schools in North Lankarshire to properly understand their history and context. Further understands that the group will examine the curriculum and provide a full action report to the Policy and Strategy Committee, which is quite a powerful committee that deals with actions that the council works on. So quite a thorough motion to look into, obviously, the things that I think people will perhaps say is symbolism at times, you know, statues and symbols and things like that, but I think are very important. And I think it's been quite good what's been shared on the Association of Former British Colonies, like your Instagram page so far, to educate people about this, and the the, you don't want to say correct perspective, but I mean a perspective that I believe that we should be taking going ahead in terms of how do we view these symbols and all these statues and things like that. But I can go into specifics about the what I personally would like to look into in the council above and beyond what was in that motion.
Yes, please, and then we can bring it back to talk about the curriculum and the statues again.
Okay, cool. So basically, I mean, the thing about racial equality work within a political sense is that a lot of it can be somewhat like flashy, or there can be a lot more of like an ability to get a lot of mileage out of it, because obviously it's something that people on Twitter quite like, or people on the media quite like. But involved in politics, like myself, there's a number of infrastructure issues that aren't very flashy that I believe would actually significantly benefit the ethnic minority communities living within North Lankarshire. So an aspect of this is that the working group that was to be created, there is going to be 2 co-chairs. So it'll be myself and Paul Kelly, who is the person who proposed this, man from Motherwell, a white man from Motherwell, obviously, so we get to work quite closely on this. So I've already brought up the fact that black men are 3 times more likely to be unemployed compared to the general population. I wanted there to be a strategy to look into this, so we can look at unemployment aspects. There's an aspect to working in a closer working relationship with ethnic minority groups to financially support them. Basically, we have like this grants process within the local authority, which is basically we have hundreds of thousands of pounds. They go out into these grants processes and people apply for them, then they come back. Essentially, when I got elected, I started to go out to a number of ethnic minority groups that I were aware. So by ethnic minority groups, I mean, like, you know, there's a Muslim women's group that's out in Coatbridge. There's a football club that's being run in Ravenscraig, which is an area here that supports about 80 to 100 usually young South Asian boys and things like that. The reason why this has been set up differently to the significant number of other groups that there are within North Lankarshire for football clubs is that a lot of these kids have Quran class and things like that. They go learn the Quran from the teachers from 5 to 7, where football classes are from like 6 to 8, I think it is. So all these kids would miss all these football classes because it's pretty standard for the time that it's there. Also, they might feel a little more comfortable. So these groups had been completely created on their own without any financial support from the council, and the council was completely unaware of these groups. So these groups weren't receiving any financial support. However, they're doing a significant amount of work. So I was of the opinion that we need to engage better with these groups and financially support them. As an employer, North Lankarshire Council, we haven't done a pay gap review of our ethnic minority employees. Something that's quite shocking to me is that as a councillor, we engage with quite a number of employees within our work, trying to deal with a number of issues. It took me about 2 years, I think, before I met a single employee who was from an ethnic minority background. And you deal on like a daily basis with, like, you know, a significant amount of employees. It took me about 2 years until I met somebody from an ethnic minority background. So I wonder what the makeup of the council is. How are we employing people correctly from the community? Or as a local authority, we should be representative of the communities that we obviously represent and work for. Above and beyond that, there's some things to do with like modern apprentices, which is to do with, I think they have it within England as well, like apprenticeships and things like that. Obviously, you work at the same time and you get a qualification. These are obviously used to support people from backgrounds that are perhaps not as academic, but to get them into professional sort of work placements and things like that, whether it's within an accounting team or a lawyer's team or just working for the council in a general role. North Lankarshire Council is one of the highest adopters of modern apprentices across the whole of Scotland, which is, I think we're the second highest employer of local authorities. In the first 2 years I was there, out of 150 jobs we had available, I think 0 went to anybody from an ethnic minority background, and 0 went to anybody from a disabled background. That was the same in year 2 when I was there, and I think in year 3, I think there was 1 ethnic minority who was hired. So clearly I felt as if there was an issue with the recruiting process. And there's more and more, I suppose, but these sort of issues and things like that, they're very difficult to look at on a case-by-case basis. For example, the one to do with the BAME pay gap review. I mean, who would look into that? It would have to be a number of people to look into this across the local authority, across different departments, across education, finance, legal teams. But now through the creation of obviously this motion, we've created a working group, and obviously it's got a political power in it. It's got councillors on it. It's got council officers on it, And through this process, we now have a forum to be able to actually work on issues which are systemic across the local authority, which is very difficult to normally tackle. But also right now, North Lankarshire Council, I believe, are at the forefront of racial equality work in Scotland, if not, well, probably not the UK, but in Scotland, definitely, to tackle a number of these issues. And also, I'll be working on a number of these issues over the next coming weeks and months. And there is also the other motion, if you'd like to discuss that.
Absolutely, yeah, brilliant. Go ahead.
Cool. So obviously there's, as part of this motion, is that there is an aspect about involving sort of like anti-racist education or decolonizing the curriculum. And an aspect of this that I'd involved in, I had made clear to the council is that there are aspects of our curriculum that are taught across the local authority, but basically we have 23 high schools essentially, and there are aspects of the curriculum to do with history that can be taught. So, for example, I speak to other councillors, and they said that they did learn quite a lot about the transatlantic slave trade. They did say that they learned quite a bit about, you know, different communities' involvement within World War I, World War II. So the idea that we can't decolonize the curriculum across the local authority, as is said many times, sometimes you hear from MPs or Conservative MPs or things like that, they say, oh, it's too big a jump. And some of the things that we're asking for from the Black Lives Matter movement, such as, you know, describing the Indian subcontinent's contribution to World War I and World War II, are already able to be incorporated within the curriculum without having to actually have new legislation put in place or new policies put in place. All that's required is that basically on a local authority level, who are the people who obviously give, who are the, at the end of the day, you know, MPs do their job, MSPs do their job, you know, if you're within Scotland as well. But local authorities are the providers. These are the people who actually implement the policies that are put through government. So when we have the leeway to be able to implement something like this, it just requires the leadership of the local authority to say, there are aspects of our curriculum we need to emphasize within our teaching. So the work we're hoping to do is, for example, something I put within my speech was to speak about the fact that there was about 1.2 million Indian soldiers that fought in World War I. There's also the fact that, you know, there's about in the region of, I think, £150 million contributed from India to the British Army back in, obviously, early 1900s, obviously 1910, 19 whatever, during World War I, to finance it, which is the equivalent to about £50 billion, you know, with a B, £50 billion. And people hear these numbers and they're like, it's preposterous that that could be the amount of money that was given from one nation to another. I mean, you put it in the context of today. I mean, these numbers don't mean anything sometimes when they're so large. 1,200,000 soldiers from India fought for the British Army. Scotland only has 5 million soldiers, and recently I was on a different call with somebody. I didn't get this fact check, but he used to not work in the army, but used to be in the army. He was saying, apparently, to put that into context, I think he said the current British Army is made up of 80,000 soldiers, I think.
Right.
So 1.2 million people of a different nation fought for a war, and they call it the World War I, World War II. But what did India have to do with the war that was happening between, you know, like Britain and Germany, and, you know, the context that was happening here? It was people who fought and died for within these wars that had literally no connection to the conflict that was happening here.
And it was often to do with independence, wasn't it? In the case of the First World War, it was an agreement that by fighting for Britain that they would be granted independence, and that promise wasn't kept, was it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, also being part of the Scottish National Party, so I mean, for the British establishment to denying a country its own independence, I mean, I can definitely say that's a theme that's continuing well into their bloodstream today, you know. But I think all of these things are really important for us to learn, because we are unable to change the past. You know, that is definitely the truth. We are unable to change the past, but, you know, we need to be making sure that we are not idolizing men and women of the past who have profited from the slave trade and other horrific actions, because, you know, we can't change the past, but, you know, it's our duty to make sure that this history is taught, because if you're not, and you're not acknowledging the wrongs of the past and its effects that are still impacting us today, then you're quite frankly part of the problem. I mean, you are sustaining structures which are directly benefiting people directly benefiting the intended recipients of these horrific acts, which are the the children and the grandchildren and the great grandchildren of these men and women who did these horrific acts in the name of power and privilege and the British Empire and glory to the Queen. I mean, so to put all this into a correct context, I think it's extremely important. I mean, for me, some things which are just completely horrific is obviously the involvement of, for example, Winston Churchill within obviously the Bengal famine. I mean, something that's quite often brought up is like, the British gave good governance to all of these nations, which apparently were just, savages living out here. But then you look at the context of what happened under the rule of the British Empire in some aspects, the Bengal famine, I mean, 6 million people died. Where was the good governance? I mean, it wasn't to do with if you understood what happened there correctly through the systemic, just, they took the food supplies from that area of the world and just stockpiled it for the intended case of perhaps soldiers might require it in other places in the world, and from that people died. Is in any case is that any way to I don't know, it's words just can't I just you're just speechless when you think about this. 6 million people died. It's basically buried in history. And now what situation are we in? This man is now on our £5 note. And is our actions like that able to be forgiven, given the consideration obviously that his role in obviously leading one of the world wars? Who knows? We've never had that discussion before.
Yeah, and it's important that this history is told, is taught in schools. I remember my experience of going through school. I did learn about slavery. However, I'd only learned about American slavery, and it was taught as an American issue, an American problem, an American race problem. But what was conveniently left out was that the first practice of the slave trade in America was when it was a British colony. And, millions of British settlers left England, went to America, acquired land that had been essentially vacated by the native Indians, who were often strategically killed. And they got access to that free labor from the slave trade. And even though, despite America becoming an independent nation, the seeds that were sown for that racial divide, for that racial hierarchy, for the system and practice of slavery were sown when it was a colony. And, we have to understand the seeds and the roots that have been planted, that we have to work towards educating and changing through strategic action of the likes that you've talked about today. And it has to be done institutionally. And the reason it has to be done institutionally is because the institutions themselves have benefited from this history and from these practices. So if we are to talk about a modern day diverse and multicultural Britain, which is a place where all people can prosper, we cannot have an education process that conveniently misses out and neglects significant amounts of the UK population and their history. And there's actually something that I found really interesting. So when the tragic incident with George Floyd first took place, and there was real media focus and media coverage on the topic, a gentleman came on, I believe it was Good Morning Britain, and he admitted that he at one point was a racist, and he explained his transition from being a racist man to not being a racist man. And for him, it came with education. It came with, well, all these black and brown people that are in this country, I need to understand why they're here. How did they get here? What's their story? And in educating himself about the story, the fact that, persons like myself coming from the Caribbean family, yourself coming from modern day Pakistan, formerly the British India, there's a reason why, and it's because Britain invited many of the persons from these countries to come and live in Britain, notwithstanding the fact that they fought in World War II and supported Britain, and were invited here to help rebuild a post-war Britain, and often came here and initially did the jobs that many of the British public did not simply want to do. My grandparents came here and worked in a factory. They didn't come here and have a red carpet rolled out for them. And in many cases, they were sold a dream of what Britain would be like. When they left the Caribbean, they thought they were coming to a land of milk and honey, where, you know, the streets were paved with gold, and everyone was aristocrats, and it was a place of nobility. And my grandparents were shocked when they came here and they saw poor white British people. They were shocked because the picture of Britain that was fed to them in the former colonies was one of stature and nobility. And we have to tell that story. And education and in the schools is the place to do that. We can't leave out this history, because as is in the case of that man that we saw in Good Morning Britain, it was the education, the understanding of other ethnic groups and their situation and their history and their journey to modern day Britain that made him have that aha moment. And in that aha moment, he changed his views and changed his attitudes. So if we can educate young people in particular about the stories of, you know, the Indians and Pakistanis who have come here, the Caribbean persons, the African persons, what happened to their countries, and that there was exploitational practices that went on, you know, it will help us to create a more tolerance and a society that understands one another. You know, years ago, there was a real movement, and I wrote my master's about this. It was this popular I don't see color movement. We need to change that, and that is not the solution. In my opinion, the solution is we do need to see difference, but we need to celebrate that difference and have a thorough understanding of that difference and how it fits into modern day Britain. So I really commend you on the work that you're doing with emotions and you know, as you said, the less glamorous side of things, which also need to change for us to get closer to racial equality. I don't want to end this without talking about the Meltingscot. So could you tell our audience more about that, please?
Oh yeah. As we've all been keeping busy during the lockdown period, you know, with your organization starting up, there was also an idea I had for a number of years to do with getting better representation within the media and obviously just experiences of ethnic minority people living within Scotland. So I'd launched the Meltingscot during lockdown. So those, but within 3 months, I think we had about 40 contributors making like 50 blog posts and having about 20 lockdown vlogs, people just sharing their experiences of what happened, during how they're keeping busy during the lockdown period. And from this, we've obviously kind of opened a can of worms of a bunch of contributors who just kind of who are sharing their experiences of being ethnic minority and living within Scotland, but just not having to be part of this whole diversity statement and quota sort of aspect, not having to feel as if they're speaking to a crowd that don't understand them. The name itself comes from obviously like you know, the melting pot, you know, coming from melting pot, melting, and they've got the mosaic, and this is the sort of shift within ideology I believe that we should be having within the equality spectrum right now. I mean, people look at things such as, you know, I've got a bit of a strange sort of opinion when it comes to some things like this. Like, for example, you know, within equalities work, they quite often say that there's more than brings us together than divides us. I personally I'm not a fan of that statement. Like, I do not like the premise of that statement, which is essentially, in my eyes, saying there needs to be more, there needs to be something in common between me and you for us to respect each other. And I think the basis of that statement doesn't make me feel comfortable. And also there's things such as, you know, a society like a mosaic, you know, obviously the tiny little tiles, they're all colorful. I'm sure your listeners are understand the whole system of that. And they say, you know, we get to hold on to our individuality, and, you know, that as a society as a whole, we contribute, and, you know, as our, you know, Afro-Caribbean or, you know, Pakistani or whatever. But then we look at, for example, the melting pot, and they say it's an aspect of assimilation, and also what's happened in America, Italians, Hispanics, etc. I actually believe that there's a third direction, which is something that could be discussed within Scotland, which is essentially, within Scotland, we have a very positive sort of narrative, which is that anybody that comes to Scotland is a Scot. Anybody that chooses to make Scotland their home is a Scot, which is extremely positive. If you come to Scotland, it's an extremely positive place to live. And I don't know anybody that hasn't had, you know, isn't welcomed with open arms, right? Everyone will tell you the same experience. But there is an aspect of the fact that, you know, a day or two into the conversation, or a week or a month or whatever long, at some point, somebody still asks the questions, or a lot of the time people still ask the question of, where are you really from? And considering the fact that my grandparents came here in the 1950s, right? So it's what, 2020, it's been 70 years, and I still get asked that question. I believe that there's a specific narrative that needs to change, where if I say I'm Scottish, then I am Scottish, and that should be the end of the conversation. And I understand that there's not, you know, any malice behind the question. I do understand that. However, there is to an extent, a level of othering that's created that, you know, my kids, or so for example, my sister has a child, my nephew Ibrahim. So he's what, fourth generation now. You know, if he has kids fifth generation, I mean, the color of our skin isn't going anywhere, right? And neither are we, right? But as in, how far down this line do we go before we are considered actually Scottish in a way that you don't need to, you know, add another conversation to that? So that's kind of like the vehicle I've been using with the Meltingscot, about just kind of people speaking about their experiences of being mixed race or different sort of aspects within the ethnic minority sort of equality spectrum. So we can come up with ideas within the equality spectrum for racial equality, coming from people who live within this country and who can obviously give their perspective and narrative. And we're hoping to do a lot of work, just as you guys have been doing amazing work with your organization. So hopefully we can, you know, intersect and do a lot more together. But
yeah, but I think this is a good place to leave our podcast. So could you give our listeners a summary of what we've spoken about today and the progress that we're hoping to make in the future?
Yeah, so I guess we've spoken about obviously the Black Lives Matters movement, talking about virtue signaling, talking about some actual like work that we can do to impact the systemic sort of barriers that there are within, you know, local authorities and councils and politics. Spoken about anti-racist education and decolonizing the curriculum, and obviously just going on to speak about the colonial past, the context in which we need to learn about it, and then further to that, but the work the Association of the Former British Colonies will be doing, and obviously my organisation, the Meltingscot, will be conducting over the next months and years. So yeah, it's been a great day talking to you, James. Like, it's been really fantastic coming on here. Thank you very much for having me, and yeah.
You're more than welcome. Could you tell our listeners where they can find you on social media?
Cool. So it's at _ Junaid Ashraf, so at _ JUNAID ASHRAF, and the Meltingscot is at Meltingscot.
Brilliant. And you can find us at the Association of Former British Colonies on Facebook, and on Instagram it's ASSOC, ASSOC _ British _colonies. So if you have any questions arising from this, please put them in the comment section and we'd be more than happy to engage with you. If you have any direct questions for myself or Junaid, you can DM either the page that I've just given you or Junaid's page, and I'm sure he'd be happy to engage in conversation with you guys. I hope that you really enjoyed this, and we look forward to hearing your feedback going forward. Thank you guys. Bye.